Have you ever read on a student's individualized education plan or an evaluation plan or on a progress report, something that says that the student is functioning like? So you might hear the student is 3 years old, but they're functioning like an 18-month-old. So you've maybe heard that sort of age equivalency. How about in older grades? Have you heard of things like they're in fifth grade, but they're reading on a first grade level? That's what we call a grade equivalency. Well, if you've heard those phrases, use those phrases, you're going to want to listen to the rest of this video about the problems with age and grade equivalencies and what to do instead. I'm Dr. Christy Preddy-Franzak, and at Inclusive Schooling, we do all things inclusive, including how to write reports, write IEPs, and talk about students in a way that presumes their competence, conveys really accurate information between the team, and above all, promotes inclusion. So let's dive into what's the problem with age and grade equivalencies. So age equivalency is saying that a student of one age is like a student of another age. Typically, we would say of a lower age. So again, I'm 5 years old, but I'm functioning like a 2-year-old. A grade equivalency is this sort of shorthand, this way that we communicate in schools that says what my ability is based upon not the grade I'm in, but the grade level content usually below me. Now, sometimes it's above. So I might be in third grade, but reading at a fifth grade level. And this can be across content areas, not just reading and not just general development. But the downside, just out of the gate with age and grade equivalencies, is they are often just raw scores. So if you think all the way back to when you went to school, you probably learned that we never report raw scores in some sort of important progress report, evaluation, or any type of communication among team members, because raw scores have zero meaning. You might go, but it means a lot to me if someone says, I'm going to get a 5-year-old and they're functioning like an 18-month-old. That tells me how delayed they are. That tells me what I need to know about that student. Not really. It is what we call face validity. So it sort of says on the face of it, we think we know a whole lot about this student, their reading, their math, their overall development. So let's just back up. One, it's a raw score, and it means very, very little. And raw scores should always be unpacked, further described, or converted before they're used for some sort of conversation. So what would be the conversion? What would be useful? Well, a standard score can be something that is more meaningful. So what's a standard score? So when we think about tests that have been normed or standardized. Now, we're not thinking about the standardization of the procedures in terms of how we administer the test, but standardized in terms of a psychometric perspective, where we really think about taking all of these responses from students in the sample and kind of mushing them together in a way to cause some meaning, to cause us to have some ability to interpret. That's where we get that normal distribution. Now, it would take us a long time to dismantle the problem with norm reference and standardization of tests, and then using those tests on students who are neurodiverse. So we could stop here and say, wait, even if I converted that raw score, that age or grade equivalency, into a standard score, something that we know that is a mean or something that is a T-score or a Z-score, we could further argue that even that has problems because we are using a normative sample that may or may not be normal, and we're using a construct about normal. Okay, so what does that get to us? So let's just pause there for just a minute. I'm going to read one of my favorite quotes. I believe it's from Sony Jane Wise, and this will help us understand the mindset or the problem with thinking about a normal curve. But then we'll return to psychometrics and traditional thinking for just a minute and play out just the problem, even in that medical model with age and grade equivalencies. So here's the quote. Neurodivergent people don't have executive functioning deficits because neurotypical people are not the benchmark for how people should function. So get that. If we take a normal distribution, this group of kids who are typically developing, whatever typical is, but it's been determined by some other test that they are typically developing, we assess their reading skills or their development. We figure out a mean and a standard deviation and what that distribution of scores might look like. Then we would compare our student to that distribution to decide if they are out of bounds, if they are deviant, if they are below or above the mean. But this quote is saying, hey, folks, we shouldn't even be trying to figure out if neurodivergent people have a problem just because we're comparing them to people who we say don't have a problem. So the quote goes on to say, if there is no benchmark for how people should function, there cannot be deficit. That shouldn't blow your mind. And you should be like, wait, we have to prove that a student is eligible for special education in the United States by way of having sufficient deficits. And if I don't have deficits, how would I do eligibility or how would they qualify? So, yes, that is the problem. We have an ableist system at play. So let's back up before we get too far down that path as well. Not that we don't need to go down that path, just not in this particular recording. So let's go back to, we have a student who's 5, who's functioning like an 18-month-old, or we have a first grader who's reading like a preschooler, which isn't a very good example. So or we have a 5th grader who's reading like a first grader. So we go back to what's the problem with that? They're raw scores. Age and grade equivalencies are raw scores. Then we say, well, let's convert them. Let's convert them over to something that may have more standard meaning. Meaning it has a mean, a standard deviation. It's a T-score, a Z-score, a stay 9, a percentile rank. Well, we explored what the problem with that is because the tests used that can produce a standard score, they're usually normed and they have been standardized as a process of making that distribution, are then going to be biased and potentially and known harmful for many students who we are already concerned about because their development seems to be different than what we expect and their reading is off of the benchmarks that we have set for different ages and grades. If we further look at age and grade equivalencies, we also say from a psychometric perspective that they have limited reliability and validity. So reliability sort of means this idea of can I consistently get that same score? Validity has this sort of idea of can I trust that score? Is it trustworthy or accurate? So we're looking at consistency of getting the same score. So if you were to test me 5 minutes later, 5 hours later, 5 days later, would you find the same results or would there be a lot of variability in my performance? Well, a lot of children have highly variable abilities and the testing situation will skew their ability to perform as they would on everyday tasks. So we often will talk about that age and grade equivalencies lack reliability and validity, all the way to you said, well, they have a lot of meaning for our team. It gives me a great deal of idea of what to expect or where to start my instruction with this student. Unfortunately, we don't have what's called treatment validity or social validity to really back up that feeling that we have in our clinical observations or in our intuition about guiding instruction. It's sort of a misguided idea that we think we know, so therefore I can start instruction at a better match. So what can we do to avoid using grade and age equivalencies? What's sort of the replacement? So let's start with our mindset. We're just going to start with awareness is a great place, meaning I'm aware that we're using them. I'm aware that they're problematic. I'm aware that they're really pervasive in our reports, in our progress notes, in our planning time. Okay, then let's think about our heart set. So we go, okay, if I'm aware of it, I need to have a different goal. So my goal is always about how to best support a student. My goal should be how to remove barriers, how to offer choices and keep kids in the ready state. And then I can pick strategies and ideas and lessons that help me achieve that goal. If my goal is to shortchange the complexity of this human by reducing their abilities to a score, or I'm wanting to show deficits, or I'm wanting to fix or remediate or catch up, then I'm in the wrong heart set. Remember, awareness of the problem, it's not in the student, it's in the system and the way that we determine eligibility, the way that we think about instruction, the way that we measure progress. So my heart set needs to shift my goals to be all about matching my instruction to the student, removing barriers, increasing choice, and making sure they're in a ready state to learn. I can't get it wrong if I go in that direction. And then lastly, I need a skill set. I need to really understand both the content of what I'm trying to teach as well as the learner themselves. So let's unpack that a little bit. But don't worry if you're still at the awareness level and you're just having really good conversations among the team about, is there a different way that we can think about, write about, and talk about this student? So the bottom line is that age and grade equivalencies should not be used. In fact, when I was going to school, my teacher said, my professor at the University of Oregon said, whenever you hear age and grade equivalencies, just say boo, hiss. It just sort of is this shorthand way to say, okay, I may not have understood all this jumbled conversation about validity and reliability and standardization and norms, but I can start to believe that there are flaws in our system and in our way of determining where to begin instruction. So I often say, sit beside the child, get to know them, have a really good understanding of both the content and the instruction. So let's take reading. I need to understand the most I can about how reading develops in humans. And that means I need to understand how different cultures present literacy. I need to understand how the brain needs to be in a ready state in order to engage in symbolic representation, recall, comprehension, decoding. I need to understand what the research has shown to be effective strategies for kids in lots of different circumstances. So not just kids who are what we consider typical, or kids who are white, or kids who are fill in the blank of different identities. I need to make sure that I have sort of this broad understanding of how reading develops in humans, what the factors are that can get in the way, and what are known strategies to remove those barriers. When I have that great deal of content knowledge about reading, then I need to also be an expert on this student. I need to understand, are they in a ready state? Are their brains in a place where they can learn, develop, grow? Are they needing me to reduce stressors or to provide instruction? Am I providing the just right supports, or am I over or under supporting? Am I too broadly calling this student a tier 2 or tier 3 kid and giving them a one size fits all intervention for that particular broader label? If so, if we're saying you're a tier 2 student, we're almost all the way back to age and grade equivalencies, because the way that you got labeled as a tier 2 student came from a grade equivalency of your reading score, more than likely. And so I don't know a lot about maybe your individual issues or concerns or needs for support around reading. I just have a general idea that you're struggling. You might have some scores that you're reading on a curriculum-based measure that you're trying to increase fluency or accuracy. Fine. But as you think about it, make sure that you're looking at the student as a whole and that you're not comparing the student to typical benchmarks and saying, you're a tier 2 or a deficit because you're not doing things just the way that a neurotypical person might do things in terms of reading, math, science, social studies, gross motor, fine motor, communication, social emotional development, adaptive, doesn't matter if we're always comparing you to typical or the norm or what we expect from kids who are a particular configuration, we'll always end up with less meaning than we thought, potentially harming the student and not creating a match between our instruction and what their needs are.